Hey everyone, and welcome to the VOX Out of Office stream for the third week that we're doing this. This week we are talking about the tone controls on VOX and the treble and bass that you find on top boost amps. I will also talk a little bit about the tone cut control that you'll find on an AC15 or AC30. So let's get into it. I am playing my built Relevator LS into the AC4, which you can't see because it's right off the camera here. That's so you have this nice view of the controls right around here on your screen. And the reason I chose the AC4 is so that you can see the very simple controls that has just the 4 controls that you'll find on any top boost VOX amp. And this will be the most simple version of talking about these controls, but of course it goes on and works for any top boost amp or VOX amp like the AC10, AC15, AC30, AC30S1, etc. So let's get into it a little bit. First, let me show you how I have the amp set now. This is where I consider it to be fairly neutral, set with the tone controls, the bass and treble, but as we'll get into and as you'll find out, that can be a little bit subjective. So let's hear my setting first. So there it is. That to me is kind of classic top boost amp channel chime. We have the amp set a little bit broken up with the gain knob pushed up a bit, and then the volume set a little bit low. This is being recorded through my Universal Audio aux box like we did in previous weeks. That means that you can hear exactly like it would sound in the room, but without interference from my playing being so close to the amp or anything like that. So I'm also noticing there's a slight delay on the camera for the controls. So just be aware if I mention adjusting a control, it might happen a second or two later. I'm keeping an eye on the comments here on the stream. So if this is a bit more of an interactive stream than the last few, because I'm talking about a specific topic, and if you have questions on that topic, that helps clarify if I haven't fully explained something or anything like that, be sure to let me know. I will see those questions come up in the comments. So let's dive into what exactly the tone controls on a VOX amp do and what makes them different from other amps. You might hear a lot that people call the VOX tone control really interactive or reactive or any kind of adjective like that. What this means is that the tone control on a VOX amp is slightly different than what you're going to find in most other guitar amps. The original tone control in any VOX amp before the top boost circuit was added, and it's still present on the AC15 and AC30, is the tone cut in the master section. So this tone cut is just a passive cutting of high end, and what makes it really different is that it's in the power section. So it is cutting after everything, after your preamp breakup, after hitting those tubes, after your gain settings, everything. And what makes that really cool with the top boost controls is that you can, on an amp like the AC15 or AC30, crank the treble or crank the gain and then tame it a bit in the master section right before the output. Now we can't do that on the AC4 here because it just has these 4 controls that you're seeing right now. And these 4 controls are the classic top boost controls, like I said. We have the bass, treble, as well as gain and volume. So the big thing that we're going to see with the bass and treble is that they respond to not only how they're set and how you play, but how the other control is set. The best example of this is if I turn the treble down to right below noon and turn the bass all the way up. So now we'll have a pretty full low end to this sound. And that sounds really nice. I really love getting that full low end from a VOX amp. I know I'm somewhat in the minority with that. A lot of people like to set the bass control lower, but I set it high because I want to illustrate something. If I turn the treble all the way up, bass hasn't been touched, just the treble control, you'll hear that the bass has thinned out a little bit. So this is the first example I like to show about what makes these controls so interactive and why we call them interactive. What that means is that the treble knob is actually shifting some of that low end, and the bass knob is kind of shifting a little bit of the high end. Really, you're going to hear that more in the mid-range. So as you turn the treble up, you're going to lose upper mids, and as you turn the bass up, you're going to lose lower mids. And this is why a lot of people keep the tone controls on the top boost channel set really low. They might have the bass set about 7 o'clock, like just above off, and the treble about 9 o'clock, not much higher. And this is really nice because you get the most mid-range out of the amp. But you do lose a little volume, so to compensate for that, I'm going to turn the master volume up a tiny bit. And let's hear, playing that same thing, the 2 controls for bass and treble set almost the opposite of what they just were. I'm going to turn play through this, and you can hear what a change that makes in the mid-range. So as you can hear, that it was a radical change from how we had the amp just set. In fact, I'll jump back to that setting real quick and show you just how big of a change that was. The reason for this big change is because you're actually changing that mid-range. So when you're in the highest setting, you're going to get a little bit more of a scooped mid-range. And when you're in a low setting, like we had changed it to, you have that more full mid-range. And like I said, the bass control is going to adjust more of that low mids, and the treble control is going to adjust a little bit more of the high mids. Now, sorry for the technical difficulties. I'm actually going to turn the Wi-Fi off on my phone. I see notifications coming through, and I don't want to mess with or distract from those signals. So give me 1 second. Okay. Sorry about that. And now you should be able to see these controls more consistently. So from here, I would like to show you turning up the bass control and leaving the treble where it is. Now, if you had most other amps set with the bass at noon and the treble turned down to about 9 o'clock, I think you would get a kind of odd, way too boomy sound. But I really like this on the VOX amps because essentially how I like to think of this is we're adding low end but cutting low mids and cutting a little bit of high end while adding high mids, which to me is that more punchy. The high mids are the punchy tone that you get from a guitar. So here, this will sound really focused in the low to high mids section, and then a little bit of that high end shaved off for a bit of a smoother, full guitar tone. So as you can hear, that's very smooth. We've lost a little bit of that high end, shaved it off to keep that smoother sound. This might be nice for some bluesy playing or for something like jazz. I could play. Or something like this. That is that high mid range that you're hearing that really makes that tone. It also pushes the amp a little bit. That's where you're going to hear most of that breakup. So when you have the amp set like this, you're going to be pushing towards a smoother breakup as opposed to turning the treble up. So from here, what would happen if we reversed the settings of bass and treble? So if we turn bass down to about 9 o'clock and turn treble up. So based on what we were just talking about, this will give us more low mids, more treble, and less high mids. So let's hear how that sounds. That's a little bit more, sorry about that. That's a little bit more of the classic rock, jangly tone that you're going to get from a VOX amp. You have those low mids to fill it out, so it doesn't feel empty, but you still have that treble to get that chimey or jangly sound. You could play some classic Brit rock with a setting like this, or a lot of classic rock in general, a lot of bright, jangly indie rock. So I'm going to show some settings or some examples of this, but if you're just joining us, we're talking about the AC4, but more specifically, the tone controls on the AC4, which transfer over to the AC10, AC15, AC30. I'm playing my built Relevator LS. directly into the AC4, which you're hearing through my universal audio aux box. You can see my settings in this little pop-up right here, although it is a bit delayed, so when I make an adjustment, it takes about half a second for you to see that. So we are looking at a more jangly, chimey VOX sound with the bass set low and the treble set a little bit higher. Like I said, this gives us more low mids and more treble, but less of those upper mids. So as you could hear, that has that chimey Brit pop or Brit rock sound. Now I want to play that same guitar part, reversing the settings back to the bass set a little bit higher and treble lower. This is going to give you a little bit more of those upper mids and a little bit less of the lower mids. So let's hear that. So as you can hear, that's a big change in that mid-range. The low end and high end that you would typically think of the bass and treble control as are changed, but I hear the drastic change as in the mid-range, which is really, if you take anything away from this video, the one sentence answer to what does an interactive tone control mean, it's this: turning the bass up is going to give you less lower mids, and turning the treble up is going to give you less upper mids, and vice versa. So if you turn the treble down, more upper mids, and if you turn the bass down, more lower mids. So this is really a tool that you can use to dial in a lot of different controls. Like Lucas asked in the chat, can you show how to dial the amp to get a clean, crunchy, and full fuzz sound using the volume control on the guitar? So what I would do for something like this is set the tone control exactly like I have it, because this will give us full with the bass turned up a bit and the treble turned down, because that we have the low end and the upper mids, and we're losing a little bit of the lower mids, which gives us that clarity, especially if you're playing in a mix with a bass guitar, kick drum, things like that. So from here to get crunchy and fuzz tones like Lucas is asking for, I'm going to turn the gain all the way up, and I'm going to turn my guitar volume all the way up, and I'm just going to play an E chord and pull that volume up a bit until it's the right level. So let me do that. So that is about as fuzzy as you can push the top boost channel, especially on the AC4. If I push the bass all the way up, We might hear it as a little bit more fuzzy. That really depends on your taste and what kind of fuzz sound you're going after. Lucas had mentioned a fuzz face, which is a bit like the bass set a little bit lower, a bit more open. But here's if we turn the bass all the way up. That's kind of a full, big, maybe a little bit less mid-range fuzz sound. But I like the bass at noon, and I'm going to turn the treble down a little bit more because to use just the volume control on my guitar to jump between clean, crunch, and fuzz, what we're going to do is have fuzz as volume all the way up. So there's your fuzz. Crunch, I'm going to turn down. My volume's at about 7 now. So here's what that sounds like. Now, if you watched the video last week we did on the Cambridge 50, you'll know what I'm about to do. I'm going to change my pickup selector to just my bridge humbucker. And this is going to give us more of what I hear as crunch because it shaves off a little low end, which gives us a little tightness, as well as adding a little high end from just being closer to the bridge, which is going to give us a little bit of bite. So it's a more drastic transition from fuzz to crunch if I have it on just the bridge humbucker. So here's what that sounds like. Now from here to get clean, I'm going to move over to just my neck pickup, which is a humbucker sized P90. And I'm going to put the volume even lower at about 5. Now in this setting, we're going to lose a lot of volume. So this is something that I would do maybe if I was playing live and it was the kind of venue or band where I could just crank my amp and I wanted those crunch and fuzz tones to be much, much louder. This is just so we can switch between all three, clean, crunch, and fuzz, just from adjusting my volume control. So here's my clean setting now that we've lowered my volume to about 5 and pushed to just the neck humbucker, or neck P90. So there you go. Thank you, Lucas, for that question. It's a great question. And it really is a good question to tie into this tone control that we're talking about. So if I'm going to lower the volume a little bit, because we don't want to quite get to that full fuzz sound that Lucas had asked for. But if I lower the volume control and lower the gain and raise the volume back up a little bit, we have a nice level. And I'm going to show you both controls off, bass and treble at the minimum position. Now, this is something you would not think to do on any amp. and it is something that certainly feels odd to dial in, but I'll play it and you'll understand a bit why I'm doing this. So this is a nice crunch setting. Say you're in the studio or you're recording yourself at home and you want to dial in a crunch setting that has that punchiness to it, but isn't too much gain. And this is how I like to do that, because with both tone controls lowered, you have the most mids you're possibly going to get from just adjusting the controls on the amp. So what this means is that we have a lot of lower mids and a lot of upper mids, but a little bit less low end and a little bit less high end, which breaks up the amp a little bit. You're going to get less volume out of a setting like this, but I find that punchy mid-range, the upper mids, is really what gives me the crunch feeling. And so this is in the middle position of my pickups. If I switch to my bridge humbucker, like we had talked about, I'm going to raise the bass because this allows me to have more bass to cut from going to this middle humbucker. So here's what that sounds like. And again, back to the center position, so both pickups and lowering the bass control. This is what we just came from. So two different flavors of crunch just from some slight adjustments on the guitar. So if you're just joining us, we are talking about the tone control on VOX amps. We're specifically using the AC4, which is right here in front of me, so that you can view the controls from this picture-in-picture window. You're hearing it through my universal audio aux box, which is giving you a Celestion 112 cabinet type sound, very close to what you would hear in the room with a VOX amp. And I'm playing my built relevator straight in. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on that and trying to explain this as best as I can to everybody who's watching, and hopefully you walk away from this with a bit more understanding of the tone controls on this top boost channel of VOX amps. So please, if you're, even if you just want to clarify something, feel free to ask a question. From here, and before we move on, I just want to acknowledge Jeff. I do see your question, basic Beatles tones, and that is something that we will keep in mind for a future video, just because it's a bit out of the scope that might need as much time as this stream would be. So we'll keep that in mind for a future out of office stream, potentially next week or the week after. But back to the tone control, if I lower the gain, we're going to put the gain fairly low at about 10 o'clock. And this will give us a much cleaner tone. As you know, lowering the gain is going to back off what's going into the preamp tubes, and we end up with a much cleaner tone. I usually like to, especially for a lower power amp like the AC4, keep it right on that edge of breakup, because with my playing, I can push it a little bit harder to get a little crunch, or back off a little to get a little clean playing. But the AC4, I do think, is really nice at just lowering that gain and dialing in nice, clean tones. So using what we were talking about before and how the bass and treble interact and are going to shift a little bit of your lower mids and upper mids. If we have the amp set clean, how does that change from a crunchy setting we did before? So here's a pretty basic tone. This is about where we started on the stream, just set clean now. And let me play you something that might show off how this sounds. So I like to call this sort of odd setting neutral. The bass is right about at noon, and the treble is a little bit higher, closer to 1 o'clock. This is going to give you fairly even response across the whole amp. So you'll have, from my ears at least, the most low end, low mids, upper mids, and high end. But for clean settings, we might want a little bit more chime or a little bit more high end. So what I'll do is raise that treble control closer to 3 o'clock. And let's hear how that changes things. This cuts a little bit of those lower mids like we talked about, or I apologize. It cuts a little bit of the upper mids like we talked about. So this gives you a, I wouldn't quite call it scooped, but a nice smile curve, or a little bit more low end, a little bit more high end, and then cut off a little bit in that center. This is great for clean guitars like this. This is where you get a lot of that chime from. However, if we just lower these two controls, bass and treble, proportionately to where they are. So let's put bass about 10 o'clock, and that means treble about 1 o'clock or 12:30. And we play the same thing. That essentially adds a little bit of mid-range back to the amp. So this is a nice way, using the two controls for the EQ, to adjust your mid-range. Don't be afraid to have odd settings with everything really low, because that is why we call this EQ interactive, and what makes this VOX sound so special is that you're not just putting things straight up at noon and adjusting from there. It's really finding your voice within the whole sweep of this control. So, like I said, a little bit more mid-range to this chimey tone. So that is really what I like to do with this EQ. I think I mentioned this before, but if you're just joining us now, or if you just joined us a moment ago, the big thing to take away from this stream and talking about these two tone controls is think of them not only as your bass and treble, but as your low mid and high mid. So if you want more of that mid range, it's okay to lower these controls and even have a setting where you have both below noon. You might think that this is cutting a lot of bass and treble, but really, like I showed a couple minutes ago, in my opinion, bass and treble straight up at noon is not the most neutral setting on the amp, and you are allowed to move beyond thinking dial in at noon and adjust from there. So a lot of people like to keep their bass low like this to give you that lower mid range. I like to do the opposite and keep my bass high to let that upper mid range shine through. I'm going to turn the gain up a tiny bit and show you this. This is less of a chimey clean tone and more of a full clean tone. We have a lot of upper mids and a lot of low end with a little bit of a cut in those lower mids. And that will give you something like this. So it's amazing to me how much the tone shifts just by adjusting this one knob. So I'm going to put the bass back where it was, set to about 9 o'clock. And here's what that sounds like. And once again, pushing that bass up to about 3 o'clock. This is really a big shift in the lower mids, and you'll hear a bit more fullness to this, but also an emphasis on those upper mids. And from here, like we talked about a lot last week, if you watched the stream last week, and I touched on a bit earlier, answering Lucas's question about jumping between clean, crunchy, and fuzz. If I just switch my pickup selector to the bridge, we get all the benefit of these upper mids and the increased low end. But because the bridge humbucker is a lot brighter, it's going to shave off some of that low end and give us a nice punchy but tight tone. That's the best I can describe it. This is sort of very full and very, you're getting a lot of the spectrum here, but you're not going to get muddied up if you want to avoid getting in the area that maybe your bass player or keyboard player is occupying in a live mix. So here's what this sounds like. So that is, once again, this full setting, a lot of upper mids on the bridge pickup. Now I'll go back to my center position, both pickups here. And I'll ask if anybody has any questions about this. I know this is a lot of info to take in. This was a bit more of a technical stream than the last 2 weeks. And we also had a bit of technical difficulties with this extra camera, as well as some internet issues earlier. So if you missed anything or if you need anything clarified, please let me know. If not, I will go over one last thing and then we will play the stream out and hopefully see you next week or for our Q&As on Instagram, as well as our artist streams on Instagram, the VOX mini sessions. This week we have Alyssa Bonagura from the Sisterhood Band. She's an incredible guitar player. She played through an AC30 S1 at our booth this summer NAMM about a year ago, and it was just amazing to watch her play just real quickly on a guitar that wasn't hers. So I'm looking forward to that stream, which is this Thursday. So once again, if you have any questions about the tone stack on VOX top boost amps, please let me know. Put any questions in the chat. And if not, I will just go over one last thing and play us out. So Daniel said, thank you for the info that we don't necessarily have to start at noon and adjust from there. Absolutely. That's kind of my whole idea of this stream, is to show what an interactive tone stack means and how the VOX tone stack is different from other amps and what you might find elsewhere. So just as an example, I'm going to show everything straight up at noon. I don't think we've shown it yet. So let me play that real quick. This is, as I said, not necessarily a neutral setting, but as always, adjust by your ears. That is a nice way to find what works best. So here is everything at noon. Now, if we just do some slight adjustments to that EQ to get closer to where we just were, and I play the same thing, you'll hear what a huge difference it makes to adjust from thinking about that mid-range, the lower mids on the bass control, and the upper mids on the treble control. So here is just a slight adjustment, as you can see on the screen. So there you go. Jeff left a question, or more of a request, to show overdriving an amp, sort of like Brian May. What I'll do for you, Jeff, is turning up the gain, and I'll play out on sort of an overdriven Brian May-ish tone. So what I would approximate for that is we're going to turn the gain up quite a bit to about 3 o'clock there. We're going to turn the bass and treble to about 11 o'clock, and we'll see how this works for a classic rock pushed amp sound. Really, if you want that Brian May tone, what he used was the normal channel on VOX amps, so no tone control beyond that tone cut. That, if you missed it, we talked at the very beginning of the stream. The tone cut on the VOX AC15 and AC30 is a treble control in the power amp section, which means you're going to cut off a little bit of that treble after your breakup, which is really nice to tame some of the chiminess of the VOX as you push it into really distorted territory. And what Brian May did was put a treble booster in front of a cranked normal channel, really push it. And I don't know how he sets his tone cut control, but that would be used to tame a bit. So on the top boost channel, we're not going to get exactly the same, although we can approximate it. Of course, you could get an AC4 and play with very close tones to Queen. So here is my approximation of an overdriven Brian May sort of amp tone. And unless we have any more questions, I'll play us out on this, and then we will see you in future streams. Thank you. Great. Thank you, Jeff and Daniel and Lucas and everybody who asked a question during this stream and everybody who tuned in. And now I am going to go to our ending slide. So I will see you all next week for our next stream. And please tune into our other streams and our Q&As on our Instagram. So thank you all.